substantial amount of text, which is exactly what we want. But in particular, we're going to be focusing on questions to do with historicity of the Bible, explanatory power to do with the origin of the universe, and also divine hiddenness and confusion. So if you're texting to those 3 points, I'm more likely to read it out, or summarize a whole bunch of points that a number of you have made, and we can posit that to our panel. So without further ado, let me grab up a question. I can operate this Rob's phone.
Is it also a Mac?
Okay.
I have my phone. It's nice then.
Oh, this isn't your phone. This is yeah, Patrick's phone.
Yeah, that would be cause for
Let's
concern.
begin. Before we continue, can you all hear me fine? Yeah. You at the back, can you just give me a wave if you can hear? Because I haven't been. Oh, wonderful. Okay, good to know. We will be skimming over questions that are inherently flawed. Don't raise your hand if this is you, but I hope that most people in the room will be able to understand that if God can do absolutely anything, can God draw a square circle is not a valid argument. So don't raise your hand. I think we'll move to a relatively easy to answer question first. This is not directly related, but it is what we call an atheist myth. It says resurrection claims not only in Christianity, but they are also found in several other gods such as Osiris, Krishna, Dionysius, Ganesha, and they share several characteristics with Jesus. Can I just give that to anyone here to perhaps quickly answer?
Excellent. So, having actually investigated these claims, we've found that often the parallels aren't that impressive. We've got situations like Osiris being used. Osiris' death being used as an analogy for the sowing and renewal of the seed, as he dies in the seed and he comes back up as the grain. So I think 2 points are that firstly, many of these examples are not that impressive if we go back and look at the original text without looking at the way the evidence has been coloured by layers and layers of scholarship. The second point, and this is true for, I think especially Isis, the cult of Mithras. There was one other good example that has completely slipped my mind, is that often these more compelling examples have in fact been written after Christianity reaches, if not formal legitimization, then at least mainstream prominence. So it's far easier to say that these mystery religions or pagan cults are imitating Christianity rather than the other way around.
I think, do you mean Apollonius? I think Apollonius is one example which people often draw, which suppose like it's written long after the resurrection accounts.
I'd say that's a subtly different issue about a miracle worker rather than a specific creed.
Right.
So it's definitely related, but
sure.
Okay. Yes, good. I think I'm too good a magician. I think I've made my next question disappear. The person who texted that, and it was a lovely question, but now it's not. So, we are gonna. It was one because I thought that many people would ask the same thing. Now it's disappeared. Okay, so let's go to explanatory power. We've got a really good one here. Where are we? Let's have a look. Okay, so this was actually asked of Tom in particular. And it says, if God does not exist, how does the naturalist prove good or evil exists? So if God is not the supreme criterion of good, then what is? It continues, but if we know there is good and therefore there is the negative evil, does that not depend on perfectly good nature? Why is that not God?
Sure, that's a good question. This is a line of argument used commonly by people like William Lane Craig. And one of the problems with this line of argument is that the naturalist doesn't have to say that there is good and evil. So I'm not making a claim with respect to that. What I would say is that there are instances of suffering in the world which would be evils if theism were true, and would moreover be gratuitous evils if theism were true. So we could reframe the entire argument in terms of suffering and pleasure, perhaps. I mean, it doesn't have to be phrased necessarily in terms of evil on naturalism. I think that's how I kind of begin to respond to that.
Sure. Anyone else?
So it seems odd to phrase that in terms of suffering and pleasure, because that doesn't, to say that God's plan would somehow mimic what we would presume to be valuable in terms of suffering and pleasure seems to be just really a stretch. What's the justification for that assumption?
There's a common view, I think, that it seems theists often want to affirm two things. They want to say, on the one hand, that God's ways are entirely inscrutable, and secondly, they want to say that we can explain things by reference to God. This is something that Patrick talked about. The idea there is that we can say simultaneously that we can't make any predictions about what God would do, and yet we can still say that God wouldn't lie to us, for example. We can still say that God would not raise Jesus from the dead as part of a trick. We can say that he would only do so for the purpose of promoting truth. So, in other words, I guess what I'm getting at is it seems we can't just say that God's ways are entirely inscrutable. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but I mean, no Christian argues that God's ways are entirely inscrutable. It may well be the case that they're inscrutable in certain respects, which I think is what you alluded to in regards to one of the responses to the argument of evil, is that ultimately, yes, we are limited creatures and we can't know everything about God's ultimate purposes. But it doesn't follow from that, which I think is where your argument fails. It doesn't follow from that we can't know anything about God's will. I mean, God's made his will expressly clear through the Bible, through the life of Jesus, through these other sources. So it just doesn't follow that because we don't know everything, that therefore God hasn't made anything plain to us.
What is his will? What is his will?
Is that me or is that
that's it, either. Anyone.
I'll respond quickly to James for a second. So first up, it's not true that God's will is just obviously clear to us. And the enormous amount of disagreement in both Christian circles and disagreement about how we should approach religious questions is very good evidence of this. So it's not true that God's will is perfectly clear, and this applies as well to very important questions. I think the second thing I'd say is, it's all very well to go and say, well, we can know part of God's will but not the rest. How do we know the rest isn't the most important part? How do we know the rest is not, for example, some reason for God's justifying enormous deception with regard to us as humans? I mean, it seems just inconsistent.
Well, I don't see how that follows. You're saying that, so the precise reason we know that the things that we don't know about God are not the important ones is because God has not chosen to reveal us to us in an explicitly clear way. The things that God reveals through the Bible and through the life of Jesus are those things that are necessary for salvation. The other questions might be interesting from a philosophical point of view, but are not necessary. So the way we know that they're not necessary is precisely because God does not reveal them to us. So again, your argument presupposes that if God existed, he would have to provide the answers to the questions that you ask. And it doesn't seem that you have any justification for that premise, other than merely to say, well, why not? I want answers to these, so why don't we have them?
That wasn't Thomas's argument. His argument was that who's to say that the part of the argument, if you don't mind, Thomas.
It's a good addition to my argument.
The argument is that the bits of my will that I reveal may not necessarily be my true will, if you like. You know, a spy in a foreign country may conceal the fact that he's here ultimately to sell secrets. But he will make his will known that he wants a beer.
Stephen Law makes an argument along these lines. So Stephen Law is an atheist philosopher of religion at, I think, Oxford. And he makes the point that a lot of theistic arguments can be made just as well for an evil, deceptive God as they can be made for a good God who always tells the truth. Now, James, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yes.
Would you agree? Too bad I'm going to ask you anyway. Would you agree that there is disagreement in Christian circles? I mean,
Well, that seems undeniable.
Okay.
Yes.
And do you think that disagreement ever concerns anything of importance?
Well, so that depends what you mean by important. So can you define it more precisely?
Questions about, for example, whether or not evidence is important to faith. Questions about how we understand texts about predestination and God's relation to his people, and sovereignty and so on. I mean, all of these seem to have important implications for how we live.
Yeah, okay, so...
I mean, does God still perform miracles, for example? There seems to be disagreement about that.
Okay, right, so I can't claim to speak for all Christians, for somewhat obvious reasons. But I think there is wide agreement upon one thing, that there is wide agreement upon the fact that the things that are important for the salvation of mankind have been revealed and are clear. Now, there are many things that could be described as important as well. Again, that's a really tricky word, that are not so clear and about which there is disagreement. But not the things that are essential for the salvation of mankind. I think that's
the reformers didn't think that. I mean, the Protestant reformers clearly would disagree with you on that. They would say there were very important things relevant to salvation which people had gotten wrong. Now, you might not agree with it, and there'd be people here who would agree and disagree with Protestant theology and Reformed theology and so on, but it still seems that these are important issues.
Yeah, so again, the argument that I was making was not that those were not important issues. The argument was about what is necessary for salvation. And the fact that certain people at certain points in the past may have argued contrary, that doesn't disprove what I'm saying. I mean, it's often difficult to tell exactly what Calvin or Luther or whatever thought about things like that. There are ways of interpreting their writing. So for you just to sit there and say that you know what they thought about this and that supports your argument seems to be rather a bit of hubris.
I'm the most humble person in the world, that couldn't be. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? So in terms of, I guess, on religious confusion, I mean, how do we make sense of it? It seems that there's clear disagreement on important issues.
I kind of want to make a comment about... Is this mic working, by the way?
Turn off reverb.
How do I turn?
Yes.
Sing it. Hello?
Use James's.
Okay, alright.
Technology.
Okay. Oh, I can hear myself. I'd like to answer the original text. It seems to me that it's kind of based on a conjuring trick. We say that evil does not exist in a metaphysical sense. Well, this is what I believe. I don't think that there are any evil and good particles roaming around. I don't believe that goodness is produced as a substance when I help an old lady cross the street or donate to charity. But that doesn't mean I can't talk about good and evil. It's just that I can talk about money, but I don't believe money exists in the sense that it refers to anything objective.
Okay, so the outcome is more or less, from the naturalistic point of view, morality is a more relative thing. It's not a physical substance, it's an abstract.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is anyone so there are naturalists who disagree on this. There are naturalists, for example, who are virtue ethicists. There are naturalists who are utilitarians. There are naturalists who are moral anti-realists. They don't think we can talk about moral facts as being true or false, but they still think there are ways to live which promote happiness. I mean, why wouldn't we want to live in those ways if we can? It seems... this is part of the difficulty, because a lot of our intuitions about what's good and evil, about what's right and wrong, have turned out to be unreliable. And so it's all very well saying, well, we have a feeling that certain things are right and wrong, but that isn't very good evidence in itself.
Okay.
Any question?
I'm worried that perhaps I wasn't the right person to pick for this, because the majority of questions have been about me doing magic tricks. So I'm going to stick to the debate, if you don't mind. We're going to continue. It's a different part, mate. We're going to continue with explanatory power, because we've got a great question here, and this is quite an interesting one. I think you guys will enjoy it. If the Christian God is proved scientifically to be true, will Christians in turn become naturalists, and vice versa?
There's a brilliant article on tvtropes.org which I think nicely illustrates the difference between methodological and metaphysical naturalism. There are possible worlds in which it seems that supernatural explanations are the best. The world of Game of Thrones, in which there are dragons and White Walkers, is one. But we can conceive of people who would say, no, those magic things they're not actually divine or supernatural, they have natural explanations. And that would be a metaphysical naturalist. They would be metaphysical naturalists who perhaps aren't methodological naturalists, because they would still avoid pissing off the dragons.
So, is this now working?
Can you just share the microphone that is in your head?
The microphone's a dodgy one. I'll have to complain to University of Melbourne. Yeah, so let me answer the question. So the question was, if God was proven to be scientifically to be true, then would that mean that Christians were naturalists? So the answer to that question is a resounding no. And the reason for that is a misunderstanding of what naturalism is and what God is. So naturalism is belief that the only things that exist are natural entities, physical entities, material entities, whatever you like. They're all basically the same idea. And God, precisely by, again, the nature of what we're talking about, specifically in Christianity, but I think generally the concept of God, is that God is not material. God is not a physical thing. So that leads to the issue where it's not sensible to say something that if God was scientifically proven, it's not even clear what that would mean. Science could offer evidence which favoured the hypothesis that God exists, but to say that something is scientifically proven, it's not really well phrased. But more to the important point, it would not prove that naturalism was true because God is not a natural entity. So it's a confusion of concepts.
I think I'd probably agree. I mean, it seems... So naturalism is essentially... I think I'd probably slightly agree with James here. Naturalism is the view that only physical causes operate. That there are no non-physical causes. So there could be non-physical things. So, for example, some naturalists hold to views of the mind, which would say that the mind is not a physical thing, it's not a physical entity. It does exist, but it's emergent from physical properties, from physical causes. So the idea with naturalism is that only physical causes operate. I think once you've agreed with this, it seems that you could never say that God is part of a naturalistic hypothesis. It's kind of like saying, can you have a non-physical entity which causes stuff, which is part of a causal order in which only physical causes operate? It just doesn't make sense.
So can I just kind of condense that last question that was raised? Is naturalism unprovable? Is what you're asking? Have I summed it up properly?
Is naturalism disprovable?
I don't think that was my claim. Are you asking that as a question? Or?
No, I kind of, yeah. And the implication of that last statement you made kind of means that under a naturalistic framework, we might think that naturalism is disprovable.
There's a key distinction here between methodological and metaphysical naturalism, which Patrick pointed out. So metaphysical naturalism, by virtue of being metaphysical and not physical, would be disproved by way of philosophical investigation. And I've given a couple of philosophical arguments tonight which I think favour naturalism over theism. Methodological naturalism is a different matter entirely. Methodological naturalism doesn't necessarily say that there are no non-physical causes, it just says we shouldn't bother to take them into account because they don't help us to explain anything.
The way you could disprove it, therefore, is if you had explanations involving supernatural causes which were useful and predictive. Lawful magic being an example.
I find it interesting when you say that. I suspect I've misunderstood something. How do you handle things like historical truths, say court cases in which it isn't obvious that there's any obvious prediction being...
I think historical theories do make predictions. They make predictions about what kind of evidence we're going to find later. For example, the theory that Rome existed makes predictions about what people are likely to discover in future forensic analysis. But I'll put that another way. Historical theories make predictions about what future historians will discover.
Okay. So I think we'll continue with explanatory power, because this is quite a popular question. This kind of relates to the philosophical absurd here. This is posited, James. How is your cosmological argument not a God of the gaps argument? I suspect a lot of naturalists might be asking, why are we invoking a concept of theism? So it continues, how is the lack of a naturalistic explanation for the reason for the existence now any different from the lack of a working naturalistic explanation for the motion of stars and planets, examples before Sir Isaac Newton? So, James.
Well, an interesting quibble for James starts is that, in fact, a lot of theories presented about the cosmological argument don't have recourse to the origin of the universe at all. They don't even presuppose the universe has a beginning. They operate on entirely philosophical arguments. So, continue.
Yes, so extending from that, so I think the fundamental question is, why is it that the argument I've advanced about the origin of the universe is different to people advocating theistic explanations for all sorts of things? Like the revolution of the planets around the sun would be an example. So it's different in a couple of ways. By far the most important is precisely the argument that I made was that it is impossible in principle for naturalism to explain the origin of the universe. Not that we don't have one. The argument that I made was not that we don't have one, therefore God. It's that it's impossible in principle for there to be a naturalistic explanation, because the type of things that naturalism is willing to appeal to, physical causes, one following the other, cannot ultimately explain the origin of the universe. It just doesn't go there. That's what Rob was saying. It's a philosophical problem. The other point is that when a naturalist says, well, that's a God of the gaps argument, again, they seem to be presupposing naturalism, at least on one interpretation of what they mean, because they're presupposing that any naturalistic explanation, if we had one, would automatically be superior. But that just doesn't follow. What we have is a set of facts that need explaining, that we can try and put causes for. And the question is, what best explains those facts? We can't just presuppose, without actually looking at the evidence and looking at the arguments, that a naturalistic explanation is always going to be better. That's the point I made about why should a materialistic explanation always be preferred over a mentalistic explanation. So if the naturalist is saying this, they're presupposing naturalism. They need to provide a reason why it's always and everywhere preferable to have a naturalistic explanation over a theistic explanation.
There's a couple of points I'd like to make about this. One, I hope you don't mind if I quibble with your slides, James. First of all, I'd like to remind the readers of, the audience.
Readers, oh dear.
I've been cooped up for too long. I'd like to remind the audience of the form that James's cosmological argument took. God is not, in particular, he asserted that God is not contingent. I remind my audience that contingent means is not a logically necessary truth. Therefore, if we assume that God is a logically necessary truth, then we can make the deduction that he probably exists.
Well, that's the whole point of early writers trying to establish the cosmological argument, isn't it?
Well, it's just a circular argument. Yeah, and the contingency version is circular. As for explaining the universe, we can. It's called multiverse theory, which he glibly dismissed.
So some philosophers of religion have contended that cosmological arguments are ultimately reducible to what are called ontological arguments, which just argue from definitions. And it's very hard to see how these could work, and I could go into some reasons for that. But I think one of the difficulties we're seeing here is the issue with saying the universe just couldn't be contingent. I mean, that's our intuition. We think the universe could possibly have been different. Do we actually have any foundation for that in reality? Or was it just our intuitions in the past have been enormously mistaken. Our intuitions, for example, about how the world operates on a very micro level. Take quantum mechanics, for example. Our intuitions about cosmology, about how the solar system functions, have been deeply mistaken. How can we trust our intuitions when it comes to saying the universe could have been different from how it is?
Okay, so I'd like to respond to what Patrick said first, since he said it first. So let's see, he mentioned multiverse theory. I think it would be good to discuss this briefly. So, there are different versions of this, but the basic idea of multiverses is that there exists an possibly infinite or sometimes just extremely large number of parallel universes that exist alongside our own. And they all have different laws of physics or physical constants or somewhat different compositions. And so the argument is most of those are not suitable for life. But we, of course, live in the one that is suitable for life. So the argument is that we can explain the improbable nature of the fact that the universe sustains complicated life, because there's a whole very large number, possibly infinite number of universes, and so one that was suitable for life is bound to come up at some point. That's the basic idea. Now, why I dismiss that so glibly is because, well, essentially there are two reasons. One is there is really no evidence for this view at all, it's just asserted. But the other view is that it contradicts what's known as Occam's razor, which is that one should accept the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions, the simplest explanation, in other words. The naturalist is probably going to say to the theist that their explanation, that the fact that God did it, is not parsimonious, contradicts Occam's razor. But it seems the multiverse theory is perhaps the most obvious violation of Occam's razor that's ever been proposed. That the idea that there are an infinite or extremely large number of parallel universes which we cannot access, and which by definition we probably can't know anything about because they're other universes, so we can't contact them. To say that this is a superior explanation to the theistic explanation is, I think, very problematic, to say the least.
First up, I mean, let's just
Hang on, do you mind if I respond to that?
Patrick, go ahead.
I think this all comes to our definition of simplicity. I'm very sorry. My definition of simple is I can write it down on a t-shirt. Something is simple if I can write the theory down on a t-shirt, and I can write multiverse theory down on a t-shirt. I can display it on Wikipedia if you like. The multiverse theory doesn't postulate an infinite number of universes ad hoc. It follows from quantum mechanics and string theory.
Then it's naturalistic.
Which is entirely naturalistic.
Yeah, actually string theory posits, I think from memory, 10 to the power 500 approximately universe. I mean, and the point is, a person might object to this and say, well, string theory hasn't been established, it's still speculation, but it's the best working model we have at the moment of making sense of some important physical concepts. And so it seems, I mean, this again comes back to the God of the gaps idea. It seems that the fine-tuning argument for it, I mean, not only is it very hard to evaluate the probabilities involved, it just seems that we're saying, well, at the moment the universe seems incredibly fine-tuned for life, and the multiverse is going to work for that.
I should probably just interject here. Got a question from Patrick. Someone's asking if you could explain God on a t-shirt.
How long is the Bible out of interest?
Is the Bible necessary to explain God?
Well, I did see an article that it tried to present an abridged version of the Bible that was about 500 words. There's a trade-off between conciseness and specificity here. That there are a lot of theological nuances that the t-shirt formula would leave out. Nuances that the equation version would not leave out in the case of string theory. I mean, the trouble is, anyone can say God did it, and that feels like an explanation because I can say Joe did it. The difference between God and Joe, or God and me, is that I have a good idea of what Joe's intentions are, and what Joe's capabilities are, and no such information is given in the case of God.
How do you know about Joe's intentions and capabilities?
Because I know about Joe's capabilities because of naturalism. To state that less glibly, I know that he's a physical creature, that he has the strength of a human, can see, cannot, for example, lift an airplane, cannot summon things from thin air, cannot fly, that sort of thing.
And it seems that when you say that, you're saying that God has no such limitations.
Well, that's the Orthodox Christian view, isn't it? That God is omnipotent.
Omnipotent is not the same thing as having no limitations.
There's logical limitations. I'm not aware of any other kind.
Yeah, so I mean, God is omnipotent. That's not disagreed about. But that doesn't really get to the fundamental issue here. So the issue that Patrick is, what Patrick is claiming is that theistic explanations are not good explanations because we don't have a good understanding of the nature of the agent that is being proposed. So, in other words, what they would want, their desires and their goals. And therefore we can't actually say anything meaningful about what they would do and how they would act. But that just seems to be a false premise. I mean, that's exactly what the Bible is for, to tell us about the nature of God and the desires of God and what his purposes is. Christians won't argue that we don't know anything about what God wants. The argument is precisely that God's revealed sufficient about what he wants in his nature in the words of the Bible.
What does the Bible tell us about what God will do next week?
Well, that's just completely beside the point.
It is the point. It is my point.
Please don't yell at
we can't allow anyone to interject from, as much as that would be fun, but it would not be useful. So please text.
It is the point, though. From my understanding of my friends, I can make predictions about their behaviour, and this is not the case for Christianity. You cannot tell me what God's behaviour will be next week.
That just seems to be a question of scope rather than one of something being, in principle, unpredictable.
I'm not saying it's in principle unpredictable. I'm saying your theory sucks.
Well, that much is clear. The thing is,
this already? Want to fight me, little man?
It's evolving into any more.
I think that's the point.
I think to keep us on track with divine hiddenness and confusion as to the purposes of God, to forgive me if I get anyone's point wrong, to sort of pseudo-sum up, we're saying that naturalism is better when we're given, regardless of whether we can write it on a t-shirt or not, we have more physical, more testable, more reliable reasons to believe one thing over another, and that's what this is all boiling down to. You're saying that, Robert, you're saying that, well, we could do that with God. We could know him through divine revelation, or we can know him through relationship with him.
I wouldn't use those examples, but
okay,
yes.
But other ways to know about God outside of divine revelation? Is that
yes?
Okay, I'm not sure that I know, but okay, sure. So those ways over naturalism, and Patrick is saying that naturalism probably is better because we can test it and it's more physical and it's more inside of our scope. Is that correct?
Well, I quibble slightly. Naturalism isn't an explanation. Naturalism is a theory about the kind of explanations we expect will be successful, namely ones that don't involve magic. Explanations involving magic. I hope you won't mind, Stephen.
No, that's fine. I don't do no magic. I'm not
no. So that's naturalism, but I think otherwise that's fair.
Sure. Okay. To continue, continuing on with divine hiddenness, we've got a question here. Why doesn't God appear? And I think someone has already addressed this. At least I read your notes. So unless you went completely off topic, someone's addressed divine hiddenness. So this is a question about that. Just to clarify to the person who made this point, why doesn't God appear to make his presence known to the beliefs of non-Judaic Christians? So wouldn't they, and this is a kettle of worms, we're not discussing evolution, we're not discussing heaven and hell, but to continue, just for completeness, won't they go to hell for eternity if they do not accept Jesus as Lord and Saviour? So I guess there's a weight behind that question. Why is there divine hiddenness if the consequences are so dire?
Well, we have doctrinal conflicts over the heaven and hell issue too.
Yeah, so to say a few things about that. So first of all, I'm not going to answer the question directly. And the reason is because the way the question is phrased is just not relevant to the arguments that have been raised. The question really is, does the existence of, does the apparent ability of many people to disbelieve in God and to not know about God, does that set of facts cast doubt on the likelihood that God exists, or cast significant doubt? And so, to answer that question, we have to think, well, if God did exist, would we necessarily expect to see sufficient reasons that made sense to us for all of these types of confusion, let's say? And it seems that there isn't any reason to believe that premise. I mean, Thomas raised this question, this issue during his talk, in the sense that, well, we're limited, we don't know everything. But it's not really clear why that's not, well, I don't want to say by itself sufficient, but why that's not a very important factor. Because, I mean, that's not an ad hoc excuse. That's precisely the nature of the hypothesis that's been made about God, that God is so much greater than us, that of course he will be inscrutable compared to us.
This is This is exactly what I mean about God's will being. God's will being inscrutable was my point. The point is that if you cannot simultaneously claim that the Bible tells us all about God's will well enough for us to make good predictions that are competitive with naturalistic explanations, and on the other hand say that whenever we make a deduction involving this will, that no, God's will was inscrutable all along. You're saying that it's valid for a Christian to deduce things about God's will, but it's not valid for an atheist to.
It seems to me that the fundamental issue when it comes to divine heaven, I mean, there's different ways this plays out, right? But one of the ways this plays out is actually in the lives of Christians. I mean, many Christians would say they've experienced significant doubt when it comes to their convictions about God, about the resurrection, about evidence for their conviction, and so on. I mean, why is it? I mean, this is just in Christian circles, let alone people outside of Christian circles. Why is it that even in Christian circles, people are so often plagued by, I mean, people who really want to know the evidence just find themselves unconvinced or poorly convinced? I mean, it seems that if God is going to create a world in which he wants creatures to come and freely love and respond to him, I mean, this doesn't seem to be the kind of world we'd expect, given that. But it does seem the kind of world we'd expect, given naturalism. It seems the kind of world in which, it seems the world that we'd expect if the world was entirely pointless.
So what Christianity claims is that God wants, well, I should caveat this by saying there are theological disagreements about this, as Robert pointed out. So, yes. But nonetheless, I will say something. The hypothesis of Christianity, what Christianity says, is that God wants people to freely choose to follow him, to align their will with his, basically. Now, in order for that to be possible, there needs to be a certain balance of evidence. That is, if the existence of God was so manifestly obvious as such that it were, I mean, impossible to disbelieve that God exists. Like, for example, if the fact that God exists was as plain as the fact that the sun rises every morning, or that 2 + 2 is 4, if it was that level of blatant, then there wouldn't be any ability for people to freely choose, or at least there would be significant hampering of people's ability to freely choose. I mean, can anyone freely choose to believe whether 2 + 2 is equal to 4? One doesn't have a choice there, because it's just something that's blatantly and manifestly obvious. If the existence of God was of a similar sort of thing, then people wouldn't be able to freely choose whether to associate with God or not. Now, that also implies that there wouldn't need to be enough evidence of God's existence, because if there was no evidence at all, then it would also be difficult for people to choose. So what we observe is, what I'm going to argue is precisely what we would expect, given the hypothesis of Christianity. What we would expect to see is enough evidence for people to rationally believe in God's existence, but not such overwhelming evidence that everyone is forced to believe that God exists. And I argue that is precisely the state of affairs that we observe in the world.
What you're saying is that humans need the opportunity to lie to themselves, if Christianity is true.
Wait, who's saying on here?
Side? I am on nobody's side.
There's a little bit of clarity, uncleanness about that. When you say align my will with God's, I mean, I believe that Tony Abbott exists, and I think there's incontrovertible proof that he does. But I don't align my will with Tony Abbott's, and I'm free not to.
Well, thank goodness Tony Abbott isn't God.
I think that there is an important distinction between belief and acceptance here.
We can't hear you, sorry.
I think there is an important distinction between belief and acceptance here, though.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, simply that it's possible to affirm the existence of God without actually wishing to, in the case of Christianity, accept Jesus as our Lord and Saviour. It's a very odd thing to do, but they are in principle two different things.
A couple of things on that. So first up, I think what you're pointing at is a helpful distinction, which is what epistemologists, people who study the theory of knowledge and philosophy, would call knowledge by acquaintance and propositional knowledge. So propositional knowledge is knowledge of statements about the world which can be true or false. So 1 + 1 = 2, it will rain tomorrow, that kind of thing. Knowledge by acquaintance is where a person knows another person. And you pointed out correctly, I think, that distinction. I want to ask, do you think people can freely act in heaven, or the new creation, or whatever you want to call it? I mean, if you think that having really good evidence for God's existence somehow reduces our freedom, do you think that people who are rightly related to God are then going to lose their freedom?
I should actually just interject here with my own question, not about this, but about, are we running until 9 o'clock? Is that?
Yeah, 9 o'clock.
Right, okay, so in that case, we're probably going to have to cut it there.
Unless I win.
Unless you wanted to quickly finish what you were saying, Tom.
No, I pretty much had finished my
And it's quite sad too, because there was another question that related to free will in heaven, if free will was necessary, but that would open up a can of worms and take us till 10 o'clock. So I'm going to give each of the speakers a final minute of closing remarks, just to perhaps re sum up their points and to say any constraints that might not have been expressed cogently before. So starting with Robert.
Well, with respect to my existing points, I've tried not to present anything that's especially controversial. So perhaps I think I'm least in need of restating my points.
You had about 30 seconds on the top there, you just threw it away. That's confidence.
I'd like to use the time to answer a question if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
Can you read one?
Oh, okay. Definitely. Okay, the next question I had was not of naturalism. So if you bear with me, I can give you a...
I'd love to do suffering.
Yes, but you gave up your 30 seconds. This is actually a question for Patrick, if that will make it. I haven't read this, so it might be terrible. Might be the square in the circle again, if that was used. Okay. The question for Patrick, you spoke of using physical or mathematical laws to make predictions. What mathematical law do you suppose could output your conscious experiences? Given, I shouldn't have read that out, that's another can of worms, but you're going to have to answer it. Your conscious experiences, given mathematical laws, simply evolve initial conditions over time.
That's a very good question. I spent the last year trying to find the answer to that, and I was unsuccessful. I would say that this is actually an example of a prediction that naturalism makes. That since my conscious behavior is lawfully determined, there should be some computer program I can write which will be indistinguishable from Patrick. And Alan Turing wrote about this. The Turing test is an example of such a program. Is an example of figuring out such a program.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so my final few words. I just want to say, make a brief comment about the nature of explanation, because that's been a very important theme in the debate tonight. So Patrick in particular has argued that explanations need to be predictive, they need to be sort of concise, they need to be precise, and all of those sorts of things. And I don't want to, like, I certainly agree that that is what a good explanation looks like when it's a naturalistic explanation. So that's what we should look for in a scientific explanation. But what Patrick, I think, has not argued is why that is everywhere and always a preferable sort of explanation. Or in other words, he has merely presupposed naturalism and then argued on the basis of that we always need good naturalistic explanations. Well, of course, if you presuppose naturalism, it's going to follow that you need good naturalistic explanations. The question of how one can, for example, explain the cause of the universe without appealing to to natural laws that did not pre-exist the universe, again, was not addressed. And so, fundamentally, I think that the naturalists tonight have failed to address this question sufficiently of why their very narrow model of a cause and an explanation is everywhere and always to be preferred over mental or agentic explanations like that proposed by theism. So yeah, thanks.
Tom, you have 1 minute. Go.
Oh yes. I actually want to ask a question on the theme of the debate. Who here has read a significant number of academic works on a position on this issue that they disagree with? So in other words, books published in academic presses, written supporting a position that you disagree with. Who's done that? Okay.
Final count.
So there's 5 people. So that's not a bad thing in itself. But the question is what you go and do with that. And what we've tried to establish tonight is the importance of engaging with the arguments on the other side. Now it seems that there's plenty of opportunity for that. So I would encourage you tonight to go out, not tonight, but tomorrow. Tomorrow? No, not tomorrow either. Weekend, okay. Go to the library, get out the best books on a position supporting a position you disagree with, and read up on the issues. I think it's worth doing. I want to conclude by saying I've really appreciated being here from Monash. Your campus is very nice. Although it's somewhat hard to navigate. But thank you very much indeed.
That's kind of what we want out of this debate, is not verses for the sake of verses, because that's fairly useless. If we're going to debate such a topic as God and naturalism, this is something that pertains to people's lives in a very real way. So if you leave here being, having things stirred and feeling uncomfortable, then that's wonderful. And if you can go and read up and be challenged, and as Tom wrote in an interview, walk away with a stone in your shoe, then we've done something right. So if you'd like to join me in thanking our speakers, we have Robert, we have Patrick, we have James, we have Tom. Please feel free to ask them about their arguments. If you see them, if you go to Melbourne, you see some of them, if you go to Monash and you bump into Tom, please ask them about anything you've heard tonight. We're going to continue, I guess, this not here, but the Clyde Hotel, which is about 5 minutes walk away. So we're going to leave for that soon. We're just going to have a few drinks and talk and chat, and Life Universe, everything will be wonderful. If you want to continue, or if you've got many stones in your shoe that you want removed, please join us for that. Also, remember to fill in your feedback forms, because this is obviously, we want to walk away with a better understanding of how we can do this next time and hit more targets and that sort of thing. So that is actually valued. And in general, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it, so thank you very much.